So I'm in Silkstone, and I feel as though I've got a strong link with a dear brother who lived in Southport in the 60s. He's gone on high now. His name was Hubert Calvey. Amazingly, there's a walk which I'm doing which connects Silkstone with Southport. Southport is the western end of the Transpennine Trail, which runs from Hornsey right across England. And there's a lot of history. Southport and the places around here that were victims of the Hales-led centralisation in the early 60s, where lots of meetings were closed down. Being closed down, they're being closed down now. And I think the motive must have been control. Easier to control, fewer meetings. And wow, what a job they've made of it. Anyway, Calvey is like me in that he's written 10 letters to the leader. He wrote 10 letters to Jim Taylor in 1965, spanning June to October. The time when Taylor was preoccupied with drinking and having to go to a drying out parlour and withdrawing from the Hales brothers. Of course, like Bruce Hales today, he's got had so much going on that he had no time for people like Hubert Calvey and Lance Christie. Despite all the money that was amassing and the fact that these guys can afford secretaries galore, and I think that's a telltale. Why shouldn't leaders, if they're honest, upright, leading a Christian organisation, answer every letter that comes to them? We used to go to, and clearly Calvey did, I used to go to great lengths to get letters that I sent to Bruce Hales word perfect, right through to this year. I'm not sure if I've made a very good job of it, but to think that these men just ignore them or tell other brethren not to read them or put them in the waste paper basket, just carry on ministry as though they haven't had them. I think it was a month after my last letter to Bruce Hales, dated the 1st of March, that he came over to the UK and started taking big meetings and getting his hierarchy to make remarks. Well, stop and listen, consider. Calvey's 10 letters to Jim Taylor are amazing. They're a work of art. They're so coherent, so well written, so well laid out that any honourable person would have taken note. And he prefaces the letters by saying, this volume reproduces, with consequential adjustments, 10 letters written to James Taylor Jr. in New York between June and November this year on righteousness, truth and responsibility. He was informed of the intention to publish the letters, despite the fact that he hadn't replied to them. The letters were written and the volume is now published as the outcome of my own deep and prayerful exercise in a spirit of utter dependence on the Lord, but with the conviction, clear as noonday, that the time is overdue for a blow to be struck for the truth in the might of the Lord's strength, for the overthrow of strongholds and every strong thing which lifts itself up against the knowledge of God. I trust the book will be contributory to this end, so that the brethren all may be helped to see all things clearly and follow Jesus in the way, glorifying God, as per Mark 8 and Mark 10. The book is available at the bare cost of printing plus postage. I will be glad to receive from any part of the world precise established facts and authenticated information preferably with dates, names and places, which would be suitable to be used with due discretion in the interest of the truth. And he just quotes the verse, "For we can do nothing against the truth, but for the truth." The letters are 10 letters divided into different emphases, you might say. The first one being to meet false teachings, the second one on the eating matter, the third one on the present position and acceptance of the ruin, the fourth and fifth on hardness in administration, assembly withdrawals, etc. Sixth on discussing J.T. Junior's volume 34, page 158, ministry. The seventh on leadership, universality, enforcement, statements to members of parliament and responsibility. The eighth on the Holy Spirit, the gospel and the scriptures. The ninth on the wrecking of home and families. And the 10th, continuing the theme of the 9th and going over the details of Mrs. Nightingale's despair and frustration at Barnet, and addiction to alcohol, natural relations, persons withdrawn from, and the subject of other Christians. And then there's an index at the back which covers subjects such as the abandonment of husbands, admission of wrong, the assembly used as an instrument of coercion, authority, brethrenism, brotherly love, brotherly covenant, burdens increased, attitude to other Christians, C.A. Coates, committal to prison of certain ones, committal to Satan of certain ones, conspiracies, courts, use of courts by the brethren, the spirit of the new covenant, Gerald Cowell, Brian Cowell, dying out of fellowship, enforcement, the exclusive sect, excommunication on false or trivial grounds, the Family Preservation Bill, tests of fellowship, prohibition on attending the gospel, the unrecognisable gospel, grace, heresy, hypocrisy, dissimulation, evasion, iniquity, inward and outward, joint use and joint ownerships, universal and other leaders, Stanley McCallum, the New York Times, and the article, Jim Taylor and Madeline Kerr in 1970, Mrs. Nightingale, we've already mentioned, Alan Price, principles spread by wrong means, principles spread by unrighteous procedures, the recovery of the truth, righteousness, sinlessness, the Stow Hill Depot, James Taylor Jr. at Barbados in 1963, J.T. Jr.'s conflicting statements, J.T. Jr.'s heresies, J.T. Jr. rejecting J.T. Sr.'s ministry, J.T.'s universal leadership and the forced acceptance of it. And then moving on to teachings, false and unsound, the debasement of the truth, unclean houses, drives and gateways, unclean persons. And I thought it might be helpful just to read out one or two items that he put, just to give a taste for the quality from this dear man, quality of the writing and the heartfelt appeal to Jim Taylor Jr. and the leaders of the day. For instance, I think on the 5th letter, he says, mercy has become an alien idea. Truth is really non-existent. Hypocrisy is rampant. The gospel of God has been repressed, often not identifiable as such. The testimony from love among the disciples of Jesus cannot be found. There may be a corner spot or two where the pretence of it is sought, in much fleshly zeal, ever conscious of the lack, and unconvincingly, which is maintained in showmanship or lubricated with liquor. But the heart delight of God in his own glorious gospel is no longer understood. Indeed, to begin to understand that would spell the collapse of the whole of the present flimsy and morally baseless exclusivist edifice. A system without warrant. The term love has ever so often been the convenient hypocritical cover for the very unworthiest acts. Man is increasing, and Christ, who will yet be God's signet, is decreasing. The sovereignty of the Spirit is not accepted. The authority of the Holy Scriptures has been deliberately weakened. Scripture has been distorted and even discarded to fit in with human notions. There is a processional vogue of outward trivialities in which religious flesh delights, their punctilious observance being enforced, in fact coercion, fear, imposition and duress are the accepted order of the day. Matters not according to the holy truth of God have been made tests of fellowship. Individual conscience is given no place. It is prohibited. Sound teaching is falsified. What is extreme or unnatural is enforced. The sadistic infliction of suffering is enforced. Diligence has not been used to keep the unity of the Spirit in the uniting bond of peace. And then in the 8th letter, I think it is, might be the 9th, there are one or two more quotes which are worth quoting. I hope the brethren take these to heart, especially the hierarchy, because the whole thing has become a monstrosity, and this discerning brother, moved by the Spirit, could see the way it was going back in 1965. For instance, CRB was put out in Bury, Lancashire, because he did not feel that he could assent to the requirement that he should declare that G.R. Cowell's precious ministry was satanic. And that, unlike so many other parallel cases, was not a question of a moment. CRB held out after long and increasing pressure, and your devotees show how they can apply the pressure. Yeah, I had 27 priestly visits over many, many months. And what was the rival ministry? Well, GRC was accused of stressing what was inward. And so does JND and FER and JBS and CAC and JT. And may I add, you yourself, when it suits you. See, for instance, your ministry at Newton Ards about 10 years ago. And then it goes on. For many, many hours I could make no headway against an array of brothers from all over Lancashire and elsewhere, gathered for occasions of which there were 5 or 6, who sought to arraign me for saying that if anything outward was to be of value to God, it must flow from what was inward. What is inward? The truth of Romans 2:29 was spurned as Cowellism. I withdrew. Have you ever heard of all these carryings on in your name, Mr. Taylor, all over the country and all over the world? If you have, what have you done about it? And then just an article on the kind of man. We see in Jesus Christ the kind of man that God delights in. And if a person was acclaimed all over the world as the universal leader, it would be quite fair to ask what sort of a man he is, as well as who is setting him up and why and how. On an outstanding occasion, the very first words of Paul, bound in his spirit and not a candidate for man's acclaim, in that chapter of love and lowliness and tears, were, "Ye know how I was among you all the time." And the bondman, whether universal leader or any other kind of leader, is to be as his Lord, and his Lord delivered captives. He never brought others into bondage. He revived the crushed in suffering love. He did not trample on them or add to their burdens. He did not quench the smoking flax. He did not break the bruised reed. But in those days, thousands have witnessed and experienced in their agonies of heart and mind, in these days, often so sadistically prolonged, and have in cases died under relentless crushing and quenching and breaking and worse. Dear brother, where did it stem from? And whose was and is the responsibility? As you well know, and I hope have not forgotten, this is the very question that beloved Mr. Ernest Beck of Wuppertal, Germany, asked you in his letter dated the 30th of March 1961, pleading feelingly, with right feelings pleasurable to God, in relation to the sad and serious happenings transpiring then in Germany amongst the brethren as a result of the new ministry. You remember what he said. It just goes on to outline. Where is the root of all these difficulties today, beloved brother? Whose is the responsibility? Is it not in the leader who has given out this line of ministry? Also, have we not, in a very serious time like this, the obligation of checking our hearts to see what is really from the Lord? And then Calvey goes on to say, he wrote out of the anguish of his spirit and in love for the Lord and the brethren. There was a fine tone in his letter. It is a pity that he received from you such an offensive reply. And I won't go into that. And then lastly, I'll just quote a bit out of Calvey's last letter at the end of November to Jim Taylor. And I know a little bit about the frustration of not getting a reply, or occasionally getting legal lawyers on telling me to cease and desist. It's not very nice, is it? These are genuine appeals to the leader. John Hales said, go to the top. So it's right to go to the top because the leader's responsible. His underlings can't really change him, can they? They're all aligned. They're eating out of his beneficiary system, you might say. So it's not easy to raise questions. I certainly didn't find it easy. In fact, I was chucked out. So, again I say, what a magnitude of responsibility resting on those who lead and inculcate habitual alcoholic drinking in the family circles of the brethren. In the active advocacy and example and enforcement of the drinking of alcohol. Yet in your volume 34 you speak of the responsibility of fathers to protect their children. Your arbitrary directions have resulted in much dishonour to fathers and mothers to this very day. Scripture's clear, honour thy father, honour thy mother. It's a commandment with a promise. And it goes on, as beloved Gerald Cowell said, if we find that our enemies are those of our own household, then we are to love our enemies. This does not mean being cruel to or completely ignoring, as is rife today, parents and other relatives because we are so spiritual and obsessed with new ministry. I have referred already to the frequency with which JND stressed over and over again the unchanging principle that duties flow from relationships. Then he goes on to say further, many still in fellowship would now not be there but for their natural ties, because their withdrawal of the one would dislocate the whole family position. Others are greatly attached to the position, in inverted commas, another customary sectarian term often used and even by yourself, irrespective of what is taught or practiced. While in many other cases, adherence has been extorted through intimidation. That is in principle fellowship through blackmail. The blackmail increasing as the threats locally or universally increase in the ministry. He's really putting into words what I've felt when I was in the brethren. We must protect the position, the testimony. We must protect Bruce Hales. Why? Why? As I said before, I learnt the lesson from John Hales. When I met him at Reading in 1995, I went down to speak to him at the front. He said, oh, I've been waiting to speak to you. And he walked me up the 3 o'clock aisle and round the back and got his hat and coat, walked out the front and put his back to the wall in front of the meeting room. I was in front of him. He said, will this do, lads? I said, yes. And his message to me was, it was about Oliver Smorden. He said there was a dispute between Garth Christie and Oliver Smorden, something going on about the new meeting room and land, and Garth was losing some land at the end of his garden or something. And he said, tell your brother to swallow his medicine. As for the other man, if he's right, he doesn't need supporting. Very, very valuable advice. Now, I don't condone John Hales's position, but he'd been processed, he'd been put out of fellowship 3 times. So he didn't have that same lust for blood, to use the expression, that his son has got. When you've been put out of fellowship, you don't want anyone else to go out of fellowship in that sense, except that when you see the light, when you're out, you realise that there's a whole lot of enlightenment needed in there, which is exactly what Calvey is saying here, and I'm saying, and other faithful men have said, going back right to the conception, I would say, of the so-called recovery or the position, or whatever you want to call it, the recovery of the truth, as though the brethren are special custodians of the truth, and we hold the ground for all Christians. Anyway, many lovers of Christ are now completely ignored and insulted by those with whom they walked and broke bread for many years. They get a deliberate, icy stare of perfect non-recognition from those claiming to walk in the light of the truth and of the assembly. Yet you yourself, Mr. Taylor, the supreme prescriber of the suited mien of all in every circumstance, could, last year at Aberdeen, greet with such genial joviality and fraternisation, as I've said, using words like, I like you guys, the miscellaneous journalists of a nondescript press. So, nasty to Christians, very sweet and jovial and jokey to the press. Not very consistent, is it? In fact, you can't make any sense of it. And yet this is being imposed on brethren, was being imposed then and has been ever since. I can tell you of a circle of an utterly arbitrary, callous hardness and sadistic cruelty and heartless inhumanity. You speak of expecting those under discipline to be restored. What hope you cherish. What pride in your speaking of them as under discipline. Thousands will echo my words as I say, I shall never return to you. You must return to me. We have come out as separating the precious from the vile, as per Jeremiah 15:19. So those that left the brethren